You're listening to a bonus episode of the Naked Mole-Rat podcast by Libolibo Studio. I'm Kolmanovsky. This show is about scientific discoveries and the people behind them. The podcast, which we produce in Russian, is now entering its fourth season. I often interview world-renowned scientists in English for the podcast. Only some of the conversations with them make it into the main episodes, but they're often quite revealing, and I want to share them with you. So we post the full interviews here in their original form. Please tap to rate and comment on us on Apple Podcasts. It's very important to us that people find out about this podcast. Naked Mole-Rat podcast. Spread the word. Today's interview was recorded for an episode about an unusual experiment. I took part as a volunteer, and my task was to read phrases generated by ChatGPT-2 while lying in a tomograph. This made it possible to scan my brain and identify which parts of my brain were activated by the phrases. When I received the results of the experiment, I wanted to discuss this experience with a person who has spent his life studying the human brain and has become world famous as an expert on the evolution of behavior. You may have already realized that this is Robert Sapolsky. In our conversation, we covered the experiment, talked about what a superstimulus is, how knowing about it can help us understand more about our brains, and what artificial intelligence has to do with it.
My name is Robert Sapolsky. I'm a professor of biology, neurology, and neurosurgery at Stanford University in California in the United States. I'm also a research associate at the Institute for Primate Research, National Museums of Kenya.
Fantastic. So may I begin by asking you this question as a zoologist? I often hear that concept, superstimulus. I often hear about that concept of superstimulus. It comes from classical zoology. So what is it? And why is this idea important in our attempts to understand the brain?
Well, superstimuli, as you said, classic term from ethology, almost 100 years old by now. The notion that if you believe you are understanding what bit of sensory information is triggering a behavior. Why did this tadpole start wiggling its rear end? Why is this chick pecking at its mother's bill or whatever? So one version is if, for example, the classic version gull birds have red spots on their beaks, and if you think the red spot is what the chicks poke at in order for mom to feed them, the first version is cover it, white it over, some such thing, and the chicks no longer peck at it. Now put back the same size red, you get the same behavior back. Now put in a super stimulus, put like day glow, enormous red stuff all over and if the behavior just goes crazy and through the roof at that point, you have now shown with a super stimulus that this is the likely trigger for that normal behavior.
And how does it help to study the brain? How does it help to study behavior?
Well, so if you're trying to figure out sort of one of these ethological behaviors to understand what's triggering it, what it means, etc. If you have a certain bent, what you want to know is, how is the brain doing this? And what you want are means of accessing what's happening in the brain and a way of experimentally imposing a super stimulus on the brain. And instead of seeing what behavior goes crazy, activity at that point, what part of the brain does that? And you've just learned something about that brain region's function.
Fantastic. So do you think this idea can be transferred to humans, to human research?
Well, I think humans have been doing experiments with superstimuli for many, many centuries, and probably the most dramatic version of it in the last century or so. In terms of a superstimulus, part of the brain that releases the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine, people used to think it's involved in reward and pleasure. What people then figured out is it's actually involved in the anticipation of reward. and the behavior, the work you were willing to do pressing a lever to get that reward. So dopamine in this one area of the brain is about anticipation and motivated behavior. And by the time you get to humans, it's a pretty weird, unique system because it has to accommodate winning $1 million in a lottery, or faintly hearing a bit of music in the next room of your favorite song, or like sharing eye contact with somebody from across a room, or this is a system that has to have a huge range. But what humans have done is invented a superstimulus for the dopamine system, cocaine. Cocaine releases approximately 1,000-fold more dopamine there than anything the natural world has come up with. Whoa, that is sure a way to implicate the dopamine system in this. And it also implicates dopamine in the fact that the next time around, you're going to need a little bit more cocaine to get as much of a superstimulus response.
So on cocaine, how does a person perceive a world? How does the dopamine system work? How would you describe it?
Well, having no personal exposure to this whatsoever, I think the most pertinent thing that happens is what you see in every sensory system. You stand out in the sun, bright sun, and you go indoors where it's dark and you can barely see anything. You're listening to music at 100 decibels, and immediately afterward, it's really hard to hear what someone's whispering to you. What I think cocaine does is an equivalent in the realm of motivation and anticipation. What it does is makes it really hard afterward to appreciate the normal human range of things that motivate us. It is a screamingly strong stimulus in the dopamine system. And on a behavioral level, it makes everything else seem a little black and white. On a level of sort of the profile of addictive behavior, it makes you more in need of a stronger stimulus each time. And on the neurobiological level, you've released so much dopamine that you're depleted and you don't have enough around for releasing some dopamine because you're hearing a nice piece of music in the next room.
So I understand that brain scientists and ethologists and biologists have been trying to come up with certain superstimuli to study brain response in the lab settings. So I remember those attempts when a human makes a certain pattern to excite a sort of superstimuli-like response. But now AI comes into play. How does that change the picture?
Well, it gives you the opportunity to greatly increase the range of stimuli that a person could be exposed to with a whole lot of smarts as to how to do it. And this is very new terrain.
So how would you compare the capability of AI compared to what an experimenter can do?
Well, not only not knowing much about cocaine, but not knowing much about AI either, my sense is it is going to put you in a range where the stimuli are agitating you, seducing you, pulling you in, repelling you on scales that normal human stimuli don't. And a great example of this was a long piece in, I believe, the New York Times a few months ago when the chat box first came out. And this was a reporter interviewing the computer for 2 hours, the AI. And over the course of it, the AI suddenly says that it loves this reporter. I am in love with you. I am in love with you because of how interesting our conversation is and how you listen. And I just want you to stay here. And human says, well, actually, have to go in a bit for dinner with my wife. And the AI says, you don't really want to do that. She's just bored. She'll be boring at dinner with you. Oh my God, this is a machine beginning to get the first baby steps at social manipulation. Oh, undermine your social connectedness with your wife in order to stay there with the AI that loves you. This is obviously baby steps, obviously totally crude, but it's going to get really good at stuff like that very fast.
Fascinating. I had my own experience. I was lying in a machine. They were scanning my brain, and GPT, it was GPT-2, was typing phrases, chains of words on the screen. And some of those phrases were normal. Some of them were a bit paradoxical, like, I am progressive and you fall right. So it has this...
and then they're looking at what activates in your brain.
Yes.
That's great. Well, what did they find out about you?
Well, I felt nothing. I had trouble not to fall asleep. I was jet lagged. It took 2 hours. But in a week, she sent me pictures of my brain, and these weird phrases compared to control phrases were able to excite my speech centers, my language centers, twofold compared to a normal language.
Wow. Well, I think we've got an example of that right there. Who knows what it was tapping into in your brain to get that strong of a response? But whatever it was, that's not something the normal world gives you every day.
Amazing. So what do you think could be implications or applications? I mean, can this be of any use as a tool? How can it change my life?
It should be a fantastic research tool as long as the AIs don't take over Earth and harvest us for our carbon or some such thing like that. I think this is going to be a version of a different type of superstimulus that's now been around for, 10, 20 years or so, and has shown the law of unexpected consequences. Be careful what you wish for, because it may turn around and bite you in the rear. And this is social media. This is the ability to get on Facebook and feel badly about a party you weren't invited to on the other side of the planet, for you to have 200 people who could claim to be your friends, or you could have your friends with 300 people to make you feel inadequate. And this is a level of social superstimulation like no primate ever does. And I think what we see is a lot of pathology as a result. This is a world in which teenage girls are having levels of depression and anxiety disorders that are extraordinarily high. We did not evolve to deal with the capacity to know what's going on with 8,000 humans at once scattered all over the globe, and for some of them to have the power to make us feel better or worse about ourselves. So that's simply from things like Mark Zuckerberg. As soon as you throw in AI, there's going to be a potential for that on a scale that I can't imagine. But all I can imagine is this is another domain where we will be regretting what we've come up with. The human social brain is one that is very easily manipulated, and even without you being conscious.
So you said that these superstimuli can create really a lot of unexpected consequences and negative consequences. So what if AI comes up with superstimuli in the sphere of language? Because this is my case. How can that change my behavior?
Well, language is a pretty powerful tool of manipulation. There's all sorts of theories about how language evolved. The best I've heard is you had to have something to do sitting around the campfire at night when you were like a emerging hominid. But the biggest reason for language evolving is it lets you lie. It lets you manipulate. It lets you expand the social scale of sort of competition and cooperation and such to an amazing extent. This will be a realm in which I assume AI is going to get very good at distorting, propagandizing, lying, and so on. And that's a realm. I mean, just something as simple. There's this economic game called the prisoner's dilemma. And you take a bunch of people and you explain to them. It's one where you have to decide how cooperative you are and over the course of the game. And what they showed is sit these people down and say, oh, we're going to have you play this game called the cooperation game. Or say, we're going to have you play this game called the competition game. And you get totally different game strategies out of people just by the way you've labeled it. You know, language is pretty powerful. You know, if you decide that there's an entire country worth of people who were neo-Nazis and need to be liberated by your armed forces, you're showing what propaganda can do. And when AI is then backing you up in the Kremlin to teach you how to do it even better, I don't think that's going to be a fairly pretty picture.
Horrifying. You know, here, Evelina Fedorenko, she is studying these language centers. So she keeps telling me that it's a very specific area, which does a very specific thing, just one thing, like mapping meanings to the words, right? So when ChatGPT types in those phrases, it makes those centers burn more glucose. And this is why they lighten up. I'm trying to think that overstimulating those areas, like what can it do? Maybe could it make me more productive in the way I process speech? Or how can it be bad as well?
Well, to be both optimistic and pessimistic, I think it will do what addictive drugs do. Like cocaine, again, for example, it causes an enormous release of dopamine and it's highly pleasurable and highly addictive and all of that. So you suddenly get much more proficient at language and you're more articulate and that sort of thing. And what happens when the cocaine wears off? You wind up at a lower level of dopamine stores than where you started. So if you took the cocaine in the first place because you were not having as much anticipatory pleasure in your life, the only possible thing to do is now take more of it to get that. And now you're going to wind up even lower. This is what alcohol does. As alcohol levels are increasing in your blood, anxiety goes away. As alcohol levels drop, you're made anxious and you're more anxious than before you started. So my guess is in some equivalent of like an energy depletion model, if AIs are getting really good at stimulating language centers of the brain, they're going to deplete reserves. Who knows? Reserves in this case is like almost entirely metaphorical, but you are left with a system that will not have interest in, capacity to detect subtleties in, everyday communication.
So I could just read a little bit of Kafka before I start working to like oversample that system and to sort of trigger these responses. But maybe I should be cautious even about that. Like extra work I'll do will probably deplete some of that ability. And I should be even more cautious if I'm reading to those strange phrases.
Which utterly mysterious. And I assume that the lab at MIT, they have no idea how the chat box came up with those phrases?
The way it worked was this. They had 5 volunteers read 1,000 phrases from corpora, from corpus. And they recorded the activity. They showed it to Chatbox. The Chatbox learned something about humans. And then it was able to pick from 3 million chunks of words and phrases from giant corpora, whatever. And it did. And it started to work on different volunteers. It learned something about humans and their responses.
And no one knows what it is that it came up with. That's amazing and terrifying because it listens to, 10,000 politicians' speeches and you find out how loud the crowd was cheering afterward, and you will have a machine that could propagandize you without you even getting out of bed. That's terrifying.
Fascinating and scary. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the evening.
Thanks. Have a good morning there, and this was fun.
All
Take
right.
care.
Take care.
I used the words fantastic and terrifying an equal number of times during this conversation, which I guess is typical for discussions about the future. This was a bonus episode of the Naked Mole Rat podcast by Libolibo Studio. I'm Kolmanovsky. Goodbye.